In any country occupied by the Nazis, the Gestapo appeared almost instantly. The task of Gestapo specialists was to extract testimony from detainees. Moreover, the goals and methods of interrogation have become a template and a common word throughout modern history. Gestapo executioners became the most terrible phenomenon in all of human history. Torture in France. Moreover, women often had it much harder than men, because the Gestapo, in addition to pure physical torture, also actively used psychological torture, which was often much worse. It is known that in France, since the beginning of mass raids in the dungeons of the Gestapo and according to court sentences, about 40,000 people have died or been executed. But what the prisoners experienced in torture chambers defies any understanding or comprehension. In the already mentioned France, women, by the way, like men, had their toes broken or cut off, needles and wood chips driven under their nails. They tore off my nails and beat me half to death with whips. Torture with electric shocks and dunking in ice water until prisoners began to choke were common. But in order to force a woman or girl to speak, the Gestapo also used additional methods that could completely break a person. For example, any woman is very particular about her own appearance, so the transformation methods were creepy. The Gestapo loved to disfigure faces, and this process itself sometimes lasted more than 1 week. During one interrogation, the girls could simply inflict several cuts on their faces, or cut off part of their ear or the tip of their nose. Girls' hair was pulled out by the roots, their nails were torn out and their figures were disfigured. Finally realizing that a woman's legs are no less important, the Gestapo men mutilated her legs, making deep cuts and breaking bones. In addition to physical torture, conditions in the cells were no less terrible torture for women. In a small cell designed for a maximum of 5, up to 20 people could be kept at the same time. The lack of opportunity to perform natural needs, the terrible unsanitary conditions, lice and dirt were unbearable torture for the girls. The general conditions of detention increased the likelihood of contracting any infection by hundreds, if not thousands of times. Despite all this, the girls were often not allowed out into the open air, they were forbidden to communicate with their relatives, and were kept in a complete vacuum. In France, a certain Massai became most famous for his inventions of torture, who often interrupted the interrogation to drink tea, coffee, and even cognac. According to some reports, he even treated the unfortunate woman. And she already thought that this torture hell was over for her. But as soon as the executioner finished his coffee, everything began again. Some people may not believe that this was possible. However, history preserves the memories of those who managed to survive even in such inhuman conditions. For example, intelligence officer Odette Hallows went through Gestapo dungeons, where her nails were pulled out and a heated iron was applied to her back. The French resistance fighter Violet Chebok went through real hell. According to eyewitnesses, when she and a group of prisoners were taken to be executed, the beautiful and charming girl that Violetta was before her arrest remained so many memories. In front of the firing squad stood a man who had aged several decades, in whom it was difficult to recognize the heroine. Violetta remained in the memory of the executioners because she was the only one of all the condemned who managed to face her death. The rest could not even turn around and were shot from behind. British intelligence agent Eileen Nern, who miraculously survived the Gestapo torture chambers, recalled it exclusively in the context of torture in the bathroom. Nern talked about it this way. The investigator immediately told me, "You are a spy and we have a way to make you talk." After which I was taken to a room where there was a bathtub. They tortured me into confessing that I was a spy. The most terrible torture was drowning, when they were immersed in a bath of water. Norwegian House of Horror. This was the name of the building in the Norwegian city of Kristiansand. Unlike their French colleagues, the Gestapo from Norway tried not to use torture on women, such as beatings with chains, passing electric current or heating their heads with electricity. The sodomy of the Polacks in Norway consisted in the fact that they specially invented even more terrible tortures for women, for example, they mutilated their hands and crushed their joints. But psychological torture was much worse for women. For example, when, in front of his wife, the Gestapo mutilated her husband or beat her children, who were specially brought for interrogation. Sometimes the executioners changed. In front of the husband's eyes, his wife could be beaten, or even raped. According to some reports in the House of Horror, Gestapo executioners even raped teenage girls in front of their mothers, distraught with grief. The extent to which this shocked Norway can be illustrated by this fact. Even before the Second World War, the country did not have the death penalty, or rather, it was practically not used. But all the identified and detained executioners who were involved in torturing citizens were publicly hanged in 1947. For this purpose, even the Norwegian authorities specifically changed the criminal code. This is perhaps the only case in the last 2 or 3 centuries of a mass execution for a crime in Norway. Hell in a cell. Often the Gestapo tried to take into account the location of its buildings. In peace-loving European countries, for the sake of justice, it must be said that the Nazis tried to conceal the facts of torture in dungeons as much as possible. But in other countries, such as Yugoslavia, the Baltic states, Poland, the Gestapo frankly, even outwardly, did not intend to observe any rules of decency. For example, in Riga, behind the walls, in addition to beatings, women were abused in their own specific way. The woman was stripped naked and forced to dance. According to the testimony of Zarenkov, a former prisoner of the Gestapo dungeons in Riga, the women were in real hell. Women were especially brutally dealt with. In Poland, the Gestapo often used an ordinary bathroom, which prisoners considered the place of the most terrible torture. To this day, it is not known for certain to what level of atrocity the Gestapo men reached, but imitation drowning, which former prisoners recalled with a shudder, judging by some data, was quite widespread, developed and changed. In any case, quite a lot of cases have been established when women simply could not stand it during torture by the Gestapo and went crazy. Mass torture of women was also used. For example, the so-called cold torture during hot weather is known. The prisoners were driven into the shower room and the water was turned on. Initially, girls and women rejoiced at the unexpected opportunity to wash off at least a little dirt, blood, dried wounds, and insects. However, the shower continued to run, and the drains did not work well. After some time, the prisoners began to understand that something wrong was happening. Despite the screams and requests, no one opened the shower door. And after some time, the prisoners stood almost up to their chests in icy water. The horror was that the sun was shining brightly outside and it was hot. One of the prisoners, standing in such a shower, said that if she survives, this will not pass unnoticed for anyone. Sooner or later it will result in a serious illness. Of course, if anyone remains alive. And of course, one cannot help but mention the most terrible torture of dignity. Young and pretty girls and women were often raped even before they were sent to the cells. Sometimes the women in the cells were forced to undress, and then they were taken out into a corridor along both walls of which there were Germans. The men commented loudly and without choosing expressions and laughed loudly on purpose. But the worst thing was for the women who ended up in the Gestapo while pregnant. Here the Gestapo began a real orgy of madness and horror. They were beaten, kicked, and sometimes women could give birth right during interrogation. Therefore, it is not surprising that, as already mentioned, such a level of brutality, humiliation, physical and moral pain, many simply could not stand it and went crazy.